This is Castle 1. Race officer speaking.
Lane line is on boundary up ahead, 35 seconds out.
A bit lower and faster here.
Ho, ho, ho. That's a good one, Jimmy.
Still gaining on the lane line there.
We're looking at 10.5, 42. Matching him on the boundary, yeah, copy.
Welcome back, podcast listeners. It's great to have you along. We start with the usual part 2 message. If you haven't already listened to D in part 1, hit pause and head back to the previous episode. It's a great listen, and we learn how D totally changed the direction of her life and ended up on the start line of the legendary Vendée Globe. Before we hear how that Vendée turned out, if you're loving these podcasts, then please do head over to buymeacoffee.com/sailing podcast. It's super easy, I promise. And your support really helps us to stay ad-free and to keep on delivering these uninterrupted interviews. If you've supported us already, then many thanks. And if not, well, why not give it a try? So, back to this edition. Before we get going on Dee's Vendée Lap of the Planet, I do want to mention this. Dee and I have both fought hard to create careers in sailing. We're not alone in doing that, I know. There are other women who have. But Dee and I do both often get asked about the gender diversity in our sport and the apparent lack of opportunity for young women to make a living solely through sailing. And so when we get discussing Dee's Volvo campaign with Team SCA, it's obviously something we get into. We haven't talked about the topic beforehand, but I hope you'll see it's a topic we both think needs airing. That said, we have already heard in part 1 how Dee moved from teaching into professional sailing. And I have to say that without that drive and determination, that dogged will to take it on, she wouldn't have succeeded the way she has done in any way, male or female. You can hear at times, I think, in some of her answers, Dee's frustration with the topic. I think I'm right in saying it's a frustration I share, that it shouldn't be a topic, that we shouldn't have to discuss it. But at times it is, of course, inevitable. I hope you enjoy the time I spent with Dee Caffari.
You know your boat and you're kind of foot down because you got 7,000 miles and you got nothing to lose. It was a boys' club. The same group of guys had been doing it edition after edition. I was frustrated that we didn't really play to all our strengths.
I mean, describe what it was like. I remember watching that start. I mean, you had a blistering start, no sign of nerves. Did you think you could be competitive, or were you actually quite nervous?
I was totally nervous. I mean, I was lining up with people that had done it multiple times. They knew what they were going into. And the Atlantic is one thing, but it was that bottom section. I didn't know what it was going to be like going the right way, with the waves, with the wind. I'd done a lot of training. I was really confident with actually managing the boat. So although I was nervous, I was kind of excited. I wanted to go and do a good job.
Describe the intensity of the racing. How much harder was it than anything you'd taken on before?
Massive. And I think it's because 4 times a day, the position report comes in and you can't take a break for 5 minutes. And everything else I'd done, it was like the Global Challenge was a race, but it was, you're dealing with amateurs. So there was a lot of downtime to manage the manoeuvre. And then I was on my own. So now suddenly, if you don't do a manoeuvre with efficiency or you don't do a sail change, you're out the back door. They're leaving you behind. So actually that whole, I'll do it in a minute isn't an option. So that intensity of realising, well, I have to do the sail change because someone else has already done it. I've got to shake the reef out because I know the others will have done it. And you have to have that push in your mind the whole time so that you don't sit on your laurels.
It was an edition filled with drama. Terrible weather led to a huge attrition rate. Only 11 boats, as you said, finished. 18 boats forced to retire. What's that like, hearing what's going on with your competitors and you're alone trying to keep it all together?
That's now, with hindsight, where I would be stronger if I got to do it again. Because I was affected massively by everyone else's issues. So you get the information, you know, someone's got keel problems. So I spent the next 24 hours looking at my keel. You know, I'm looking in a box at the keel ram. I'm trying to look over the side at my keel. Looking at it isn't going to make any difference. I know that now. But at the time I was like, oh, what if? And then the big thing for me was when Mike dismasted. Here I am on a Zach replica boat, you know, with sister ships. And so then I spend my next 24 hours on deck just looking at my rig, you know, binoculars, checking everything. And you're just thinking, is that going to happen to me? And I kick myself now. And I know if I did it again, you don't worry about that. You work your boat until you have the problem. But at the time I was super affected by everyone. And of course, with that war of attrition that we had that year, it was quite hard work.
They do say, don't they, that, you know, we forget the hard times and remember the good. If I ask you now, what's your lasting memory of that race? The one thing that you would think about, what would it be?
For me, I had quite an unusual Cape Horn, and we got told by the race director, I don't think this has ever happened in history since, but we got told by the race direction, there was myself, Brian Thompson on Pindar, and Arnaud Bossier on his boat, and we got told to stop racing to wait for a storm. There was this massive storm going across Cape Horn as we got there, and we'd been together since Christmas, and we'd been talking, have you seen the weather? And you spend your whole time going, well, the European model says this and the American model says that. We'd like that one better, we'd look at that one. So you just choose the one that you like the best. But we knew that we were going to get hit, and they said, oh, you need to stop racing. And at first I thought it was a bit of a joke, because the race management don't tell you to do that normally. So we checked with each other and we'd all had the same message. And so I was there at Cape Horn, and I was in my own little I was right in the centre, so I didn't get much of the weather. And I remember putting all the reefs in, charging my batteries, like doing all the jobs, tucking in my mainsail because it was falling apart, and getting ready thinking, well, shall I go yet? Have the others gone? Shall I go yet? I don't know. I don't want to wait too long. I don't want to let them get the jump on me. Brian had said that he was going to push on, and he got to the island by Le Maire Straits, and he said that he'd seen 80 knots. And he was just in the lee of the island. And I was like, well, I'm glad I'm where I am and not with a landmass too close. And we didn't get a go from the committee, but we all kind of made that decision. And it was the right thing. The most I saw was probably 56 knots, something like that. The worst had gone through, but as I say, Brian saw 80 knots. So I'm kind of like grateful they did pause us. But after that, psychologically, you're back in the Atlantic. So you have a bit more confidence. Things are getting warmer, rescue's closer, you know your boat, and you're kind of foot down because you got 7,000 miles and you got nothing to lose. But also you've got everything to lose in that time as well. So it is quite difficult to rationalise, but I was just foot down. I know how to sail my boat now. And I was sailing it so much better in the second half of the Vendée than I was at the first half. And I remember just pushing and pushing and pushing, and we left Arnaud Bossier behind. And Brian and I were pushing and pushing, and Sam had some really bad weather, Sam Davis ahead, and we'd caught her up, and we were all approaching the doldrums. And then they got through and the door shut on me, and I was devastated. But that bit then of just pushing really hard and sailing hard and fast, I was like, this is what I should have been doing from the beginning.
99 days after leaving Les Sables d'Olonne, you arrived back. Crossing the line, you stood on the bow of the Yellow Aviva, draped in a Union Jack. As we've said, a very professional and accomplished fleet in tatters in ports all around the world, and you finishing in a very impressive 6th place. How good did that feel?
It was unbelievable. I think if someone had offered me a top 10 on the dock before I left, I would have bitten their arm off. You know, that would have been amazing. But it was a war of attrition, and it was about getting to the finish line. And I managed to hold it together. But I remember coming in, and it was an amazing day. It was February, and it was super cold, but really blue skies, really bright. And the armada that comes out to meet you, and you're like, wow. But everybody came out, and they were like, oh, look, there she is. Oh, look. And they just immediately all looked at the mainsail. And I was like, hello, what about me? What about me? And everyone was looking at this devastated mainsail that had just basically delaminated all the way from Australia. So it was a bit of a talk of the race, really.
Describe that welcome that greeted you, though, in the Stade Toulon.
It's amazing. You try and get prepared for it, and because you don't want to be cleaning your teeth when, people come and see you, but they come out so far. You're doing a lot of miles with them, and then you're like, I need to look good, so I need to make sure the trim's right. And you want to set it all up so that you don't have any manoeuvres to do or sail changes to do. You just want it to happen. But to do it daylight, to have good weather, to encourage people out, it was just incredible. And the bit that blew me away was you're in France, I'm a British sailor, and they still come out in thousands to see you in. And it's all for you because you're the only one there. It's not like there's a fleet of boats coming in and who's got first place. We're all on different days and they're there. And so it's all just for you. It was amazing.
Well, Dee, you never stopped racing. You were hooked and rolled into around the world double-handed in the Barcelona World Race with Anna Corbella. And at the end of 2012, SCA announced a well-funded all-women's campaign for the next edition of the Volvo. How exciting was the prospect of this?
It was massive. It was massive for sailing. It was massive for women sailing. And the key thing there was it was going to be well-funded. It wasn't a second-rate team following the boys or getting the cast-offs. It was meant to be racing on a level playing field, funded to do the job. And that's why it was exciting.
Describe the dynamic, how the team came together. I mean, individually very talented women.
It was a hard process, and I remember I spent 18 months trying to get my opportunity to trial for the team. I think the presumption was I was a solo sailor and I'd be wrong for the dynamic. But I just wanted that opportunity to have the chance. And I was aware that the longer you're outside the team, the harder it is to integrate yourself in. And also just on a pure fitness level, when you're not training at the same intensity, you don't know what they're doing, so it's hard to do it on your own. I was one of the last ones in with Libby Greenhout, and the team had been together 18 months by the time I joined them. And I went with just the attitude of I wanted to be there, I wanted to be part of it, because it was kind of groundbreaking, and I'd do whatever it took to do it. And I was filling water bottles, cleaning food, whatever I had to do. But it was a strange dynamic, as you say. Individually, everyone was really highly skilled, but it was quite hard to mesh us together, and it took time. And that old adage that once you've done a lap, you then know what you should be doing and you could do the next one better. That was our warm-up lap. Would have been good to have gone straight into a second one.
Normally a skipper would surround themselves with people they've worked with before, and so there's a camaraderie already, there's an element of trust. How was this team put together?
So it was put together to fulfill certain criteria, certain abilities, but nobody was given that responsibility until quite late. Sam Davies got the responsibility of being the skipper really late. And what I felt we didn't really do was play to our strengths. We had some key people that had done, their whole life had been training 15, 25 starts a day, yet they weren't doing the starts of our racing. There were key people that were match racing champions, and we weren't going to them for the boat-on-boat strategy. And I just felt that there was a lot of skills on the boat that were underutilised. And it took us a long time to figure out the right dynamic to get the right people doing the right jobs.
It had been 12 years since women had had a real presence in the race. I mean, lots of missed experience, I guess, to fast track.
A big gap. And it was a boys' club. The same group of guys had been doing it edition after edition, racing with their mates, and we were trying to break into that. And it was an interesting dynamic. We were a female team managed solely by guys, which is quite a strange dynamic in itself for them and for us. But the really interesting thing was that thought that we couldn't really do it. So they fought to fight the point system on the import racing compared to the offshore legs. They wanted to keep it separate, thinking that we would let ourselves down on the inshore racing, so they didn't want the points to carry across. As it so happens, we won a couple of those and actually came out third place on the inshore racing series. And that whole element of having more hands available to do the tasks on board, we played to our strengths. And so I think that surprised a few people. And that was really nice to kind of put that doubt that everybody just assumed out the way.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you were a female boat, but yet managed by men. I mean, it certainly looked like that also from the outside. When we filmed with the project a few times, and initially, you know, I always thought it was rather disappointing that in a sport that is essentially about decision making, it was a campaign run and managed not by the sailing team, certainly initially, but by men. As you say, veterans of the race paid well to steer the campaign in the right direction. I mean, it did look from the outside that at least for the first half of the lap of the planet, that it wasn't owned by the sailors. Is that fair? And did that change as the race progressed?
Well, I have to be quite careful here. I mean, this is only my perspective, but for me, it was an 18-month project where I lost a lot of confidence. I left that campaign months back, you know, lost confidence in my own ability, what I'd done, what I'd achieved in the past. I had the opportunity to meet some fabulous people, and I learned loads from all these skilled sailors in all these different disciplines of our sport, and that was fabulous, and I've got friends for life from that. But the actual setup was not one of trust, camaraderie and support. It felt like backstabbing, not by nature that we all wanted to beat the other person, but we all wanted a place on a boat, and it was always unknown before each leg until quite late. So you didn't know if you were on, if you were off, what you'd done wrong, if you were doing something wrong, or there didn't seem to be a system, it just seemed to be a choice. Maybe for the hierarchy there was a system, but as somebody who was receiving that system, it was just really uncomfortable, and it created a culture that I didn't really feel comfortable or enjoy.
You'd always, up to then, ploughed your own furrow. You'd been in charge of your own destiny. How difficult was it to then not be?
I think that's maybe why I found it harder than most. Frustrated. I was frustrated that we didn't really play to all our strengths. And I knew we had some good skills on board. I felt a lot of people were underutilised. But what ended up to me in a short space of time, it did evolve over time, which is why I said we probably needed a second lap off the back of the first to make it really come together. And I think that's where we'd all found where we sat, what we could do, what we could offer. And I think trust needed to build between us as well. But it was my first foray into having a role in someone else's project, and you are just expected to do your job. And actually there I learned a lot. I was able to observe and take in quite a lot, which I didn't know was actually going to help me for the next project. So it was really valuable to me, the lessons that were good and the lessons that I wouldn't want to repeat, so that I could implement that going forwards.
Like what? I mean, when you look back on the race, what were your takeaways?
So that structure of understanding the thought process of who's on, who's off, for me, you want buy-in, you want everyone to be on the same page. That knowing where our strengths and our weaknesses are and how we're dealing with that was quite important for me. To have trying to create an atmosphere where everybody felt that they could speak up and be heard and not be criticised or have some unintended consequence from that. To give them the confidence that it was okay to have an opinion. SCA for me was an environment where you had to keep quiet. If you stuck your head up the parapet, it was kind of shot down a little bit. That's how I was made to feel. That might have been self-inflicted. I don't want to put, anything out of place, but it wasn't a very conducive atmosphere for development and confidence.
So how tough was that? It's a long race, isn't it, when you feel you can't speak up?
It's a really long race, 10 months around the world, plus the 6 months leading up to it. It was a long old time, but I probably learned more about myself and managing other people in that time by observing that than I realised at the time. Since then I've been able to look back, and the lessons learnt were huge. So at the end of the ocean race, all the boys have got sailing to go to, and the girls were still like, right, what do we do now? All the guys would be holding a really valuable bit of string, and all the girls would be grinding and moving 100-kilo sails. I was like, are we playing to our strengths here?
I just rewatched the final SEA rap video, and it was so full of hope for women's offshore sailing. You know, Carolyn Breyer said, "We've put women's offshore sailing on the map for it never to be removed." It was so full of optimism. 6 years have passed and another edition of the Volvo Ocean Race. What are your thoughts on the effect that SEA campaign had?
I think it made the impact that was needed at the time. If we hadn't have done it then, I fear that our sport would have moved on and it never would have welcomed female sailors to a greater or lesser degree. I think it was needed. I think it's a shame the legacy didn't continue as we all hoped. We all thought there'd be another run because, as we'd seen with the guys, when you do multiple editions, your confidence and your experience grows and the performance obviously delivers after that. And as soon as you get a gap, it's quite hard to do that. But to solve the problem of that potentially not happening, we had the incentivized rule change, which I think has been a real kind of game changer in the future of this pinnacle crewed event around the world. And we're seeing the repercussions of that. I think nearly everyone that was involved in SEA managed to be involved in the next race in some form or another, with there being a female on every boat, and new people came on. But I think the key thing for me was getting more men to understand what it's like to sail mixed and realise it's not as bad as they thought it was, and actually it's quite a viable option. And we need more of that so that they can go on and make it happen in the future.
I know we both get asked questions like this a lot, but it's hard as a woman in this sport not to sound like a broken record. It's also important to discuss the lack of opportunity out there, isn't it? I mean, from someone that came into sailing, you must have thought at the time you made that leap that there were opportunities for you. But if you look at how much change there's been in society since, do you think sailing has stayed the same or possibly even worse than when you began your career?
I'm a glass half full person, so I want to be really positive, and I want to say all the good things and say it from a perspective that probably sounds better than it is in reality. But having been that person in that position, you know, I've done 6 laps of the planet, and just this year was my first time of doing the Maxi Worlds in Sardinia and Saint-Tropez on a super yacht in that professional sailing arena where you have to know somebody or get invited in. And you look around the dock and you're still the minority. There's still very few women involved. So when you look critically and you're faced with the same battles all the time, you realise it hasn't really changed. And I remember getting to the end of the last edition of the Ocean Race where I was always asked about women in sailing. It was, you know, I was the female skipper. So there I was, 2004, the only female skipper in the Global Challenge. There I was, 2017, the only female skipper in the Ocean Race. You know, if you look at that span, the sport hasn't moved on. I was asked, oh, this has been game changing. There's a female on every boat. This has totally changed everything. By the time I got to the last press conference in The Hague, I had to just speak from the heart and not kind of give a corporate line. And I was like, no, it hasn't, because the last few legs of the Ocean Race, you've got all the guys planning their next bit of sailing. Oh, I've got a ride on this, do you want to come with me? Or I've got a delivery here, do you want to come with me? And, you know, none of the girls were included in that conversation, yet the guys had just sailed around the world with them. But they didn't ever ask the girls if they wanted to. So at the end of the Ocean Race, all the boys have got sailing to go to. And the girls were still like, right, what do we do now? And it's the opportunity stopped and there still wasn't any doorways opening to them. So the reality there is it hasn't changed anything. We're still forging our own way and having to create something which makes us talk about it, which makes everyone, as you say, oh, you're saying the same thing again, here they go again. And we are people that have just got on and done it. So part of me is just like, oh, we'll just get on and do it. But it shouldn't have to be that way. And we don't want the positions just to tick a box or meet a quota. We want to be there on merit. But the argument is there's loads of jobs that can be done on a boat that aren't physically demanding, that only the guys are strong enough to do. And as I said before, I think we just need more guys to sail with girls and realise it's not as bad as they all think it is.
I mean, it can be quite depressing. I mean, a good measure of the, let's call them inroads, although we really shouldn't have to, but the progress being made for opportunities for women in pro sailing. If you take a look at the crew list on the Max Saves, there's something like 27 on Comanche as it sails in the Middle Sea race. 27 spaces, in no way, as you say, all of them really physical, and all filled by men. I mean, looking at scenarios like that, the sport isn't really moving on at all, is it?
No, and the reality is all these big fancy race boats that everyone looks at are all fully male crews. But then you look, out a little bit more and you see the Cape 31 class in the UK that's growing. Nearly every boat's got a female on board. And you're like, that's fabulous. What are they doing that's different? Why is that working and it's not working elsewhere? The double-handed fleet that we've been racing in, there's loads of females in there and you're like, that's great. What's the difference? What's the key difference? And when we see the big events, the pinnacle events that the press are looking at, like Sail GP, try and implement their change, the ocean race, try and implement their change, you can see both sides of the coin. You see it as a positive move, but then you've got capable Olympians and world champions sat in a wetsuit as a guest spot on a boat being raced by guys. And it's like, are they really addressing what we're trying to achieve here? It's really hard.
All right, we could talk about this all day, wouldn't they? I think our listeners might switch off. Let's get back to your racing, Dee. The next Volvo Ocean race was in 1718, and this time you were asked to skipper your own boat. Tell us about that campaign, how it came about, and what your role entailed.
It was a campaign with a difference. It was a phone call with Mark Turner. He was the CEO of the Ocean Race at the time. And we'd had a few conversations of if it could be possible. And then he pulled the pieces of the puzzle together and said, look, this is there, do you want it? And I just knew that this was a culmination of loads of things I'd done in my career coming together in one project. Be it the environmental stuff from being an ambassador for the Green Blue and having, the ocean as our racetrack, I think we're quite privileged. Having been a teacher and then being asked to have a young crew. It's all about offering opportunities for the next generation to step through. Being fully mixed, I'd obviously been quite vocal about opportunities for female sailors, and I was being asked to put my money where my mouth was. And then representing the United Nations with 10 different nationalities on board in one team. It's the ultimate in man management and getting the best from a team. And it was an awesome project. Apart from my solo stuff, probably something that I'm most proud of, I think.
It was a pretty late campaign, relatively underfunded. And as you say, it was a mix of everything, wasn't it? Experience, talent, gender, nationality. I mean, was there ever a moment when you thought, what the hell have I taken on?
Yeah, as you say, it came together really late. The green light was given in June and we had to be racing in August as the qualifiers. The prologue, leg zero, fastnet, that was all part of it. We had to do our qualification, our sea survival and all our courses September time to be in Alicante for October. So suddenly this was happening really quickly. Was already committed to do the Transpac in July. So I was going to be missing for a period racing to Hawaii. So I did kind of think, is this too much too good to be true? And can we really pull it off? The other thing with the ocean race is generally you buy in experience and confidence and, the guys that have done it before. And by nature of 80% of my crew that I had to negotiate being under 30, it was not going to happen. They hadn't sailed around the world before, these guys. But also I look back on my career and think, well, that's exactly what I can deliver. Who else in the industry would be prepared to deliver that? And did I really want to do it? And if I did really want to do it, then despite the finances, I'd make it happen. And I just decided it was too good to not face the challenge.
Back in the day, talking to skippers like Kenny Reid, Paul Cayard, Bauer Becking, they all talk about this sense of responsibility, that leadership role is so much more, than racing around the planet. You have to make safe decisions as well as race-winning decisions. How nervous were you of taking on that role?
I think I felt the pressure that I wanted to make the decision so that they could perform, or show everybody they could perform competitively against the fleet. I didn't want to be the boat that followed everyone around the world. But also I knew I had the talent there, and I knew I could get amateurs around the world, so I knew I could get these guys around the world. So I was probably quite confident in that respect, but the pressure for me was being on this competitive platform that the whole world has an opinion on. So, any mistake, you're criticised quite quickly, whether it was a mistake or not.
I suspect also within the boat too, there was a massive range of expectation of performance. I mean, you had people who barely knew how to load the winch at the beginning, didn't you? And you had guys who'd, done years and years in the Figaro. How did you manage that? How do you go about bringing that together?
That was quite fun, actually, because they were all really skilled in their own fields, and I had to bring them together in this environment, of which the majority of them didn't really know how to live offshore, especially didn't know how to survive the Southern Ocean. And here we were going in exactly those places. But getting the right roles for people on the boat was quite interesting. And naturally, as a default, I was fully mixed, so 5 girls, 5 guys. And we had to catch ourselves every so often. We agreed to play to our strengths and be proficient in our manoeuvres. And every now and again, I'd have to say, whoa, are we in the right positions here? Because naturally, out of confidence, all the guys would be holding a really valuable bit of string, and all the girls would be grinding and moving 100-kilo sails. I was like, are we playing to our strengths here? And it was just a confidence level. The girls would doubt themselves to trim the sails to go fast compared to the guys. So they would naturally give up the trimming to the guys, and then they would just grind because I don't have to make a decision then. And I realised then that I needed to empower them to do these roles that they knew how to do. We've got Olympic medalists who know how to make a boat go fast. Just make this boat go fast. So it was a bit of a balance. And actually the skilled Figaro sailors, they were good in all areas and wanted to be in all areas. And I was like, I need to control you into one area, because actually we need to empower everybody else to do their roles that you can support. And actually finding them the right role was really important too. So I found that a really interesting process, and I think we did quite a good job of it.
It's a big job, ocean race skipper, isn't it? I mean, it's not just the sailing, it's everything else that goes along with it. And as you say, your performance is scrutinised at every press conference, at every interview. It's never ending. How did you cope with that, Dee?
I think the sailing's almost the easy bit. You go offshore for a bit of a rest. But yeah, the other bit is intense. And what I did, by nature of how I wanted my team to feel, I almost did myself out of a job. And I found myself in a bit of no man's land, because I was empowering them, giving them ownership and responsibility, giving them their roles and responsibilities to own, that I kind of floated round, and I was like, oh, I don't know where my position is. And it took me a little while to sort that. And we made a few changes on different legs. And then some legs I felt much happier because I was more within the structure of the boat and not floating around the periphery. And actually by me being happier, it had a positive effect on the boat and the performance. But the frustration I always have from that race is that we were in the mix, super competitive all the time, and the results on the tables don't really show it.
How hard is that as the skipper? The one in the press conference and the media briefing, and you're the leader of it all.
Yeah, no, I found that bit hard. My worst day of every stopover was that day where you have the skipper's briefing and the press conference. Thankfully, it was all on one day, so it was just my one bad day. But I suffered with a bit of imposter syndrome. I was definitely having to take a deep breath and have an internal monologue with myself before going into the skipper's briefing. I did that whole, they're not going to listen to me if I have an opinion, and what am I going to say? And oh, here we go again. And the guys would probably be completely unaware that was the atmosphere that was created. It was my interpretation. So I was probably my own worst enemy, but I just hated that whole here we go again, sit around the table while the boys have a discussion, and I'll just walk away from it. And then you go straight into the media briefing, which was, if you're on the podium positions, you get asked about tactics and strategy. Charlie Enright would get asked about environmental things, and I'd get asked about women in sailing. And it was like the stereo format of every press conference. And it was only by the end that I had the confidence to speak out and challenge what people just assumed that I would say the same thing to. And that was because I realised that I was the voice of the other female sailors in the whole of the ocean race taking part, who didn't want to speak out for anything because they want to make sure they get their next ride. They're at the start of their careers, and I realised I'm a bit long in the tooth now and can have a voice and have an opinion, and I am the skipper, so I can say it without the repercussions. And once I realised that, I think they felt empowered and supported. And it was really interesting that sailing is about confidence, and it's that support network.
With the Volvo lap behind you, as skipper, how different was that race to your SCA campaign? And as the skipper, would you have done anything differently on that Turn the Tide campaign?
I loved the whole experience, and I loved that the team I started with were not the team I finished with. As physically, they were the same people, but the characters within had grown in that 10-month period. Well, I had them for a year. I was like, give me a year of your lives and you'll sail around the world and have the time of your lives. And I really feel that they did. I'm still as close to them now as I was then. I've watched their careers. I'm like a proud mum. You know, they've all gone off, here, go into the industry, see what you can do. And they're all doing great things. And yeah, it's a sense of pride that we did a good job. And yes, we made mistakes and you learn from them. And that's probably why we always want to go back, because you know you can do it better next time. But I learned a lot about me. I implemented a lot of the things I'd learned through the other adventures I've had to do a good job. And you still know where you can tweak things. I found it quite hard to have the skipper's hat on and then sit in the debrief and be that person to do the debrief. You know, I didn't have any external people taking on that responsibility. So I felt I was wearing lots of hats, and I'd love to do it again where I'm one of the team that has the external people come in and help work through the issues and problems and the good and the bad.
We've just spent this double-handed offshore season racing against each other, haven't we, Dee? You know, how much do you enjoy that series? I mean, I've loved it. And in fact, I've been really surprised, actually, just how much I've enjoyed it.
I've loved it. It's been fun. It's actually given me a lot of confidence back. I said SCA, I lost a lot of confidence. Turn the Tide, I got more back, but I felt I didn't really have a role. You know, I was kind of overseeing everyone. And this has just allowed me to get hands-on doing everything again and reminding me that I can trim a sail, I can drive a boat, you can do everything. Because it's been a while since I've sailed single-handed and double-handed, and you know, there isn't a passenger on a double-handed boat, you've got to do everything. And I've just really enjoyed that if it's a mistake, it's your mistake and there's nowhere to hide. And I've liked it, you know, and it's been hugely competitive. We know that if one of us makes a mistake, the other one's going to capitalise on it and rub it in our faces. And I've really enjoyed it.
Were you disappointed at the Olympic decision? For a while there, it looked like a possible discipline for Paris 2024. I mean, how much would you have loved to put together an Olympic campaign?
I was super excited. I had spent a year where I was like with most of my Turn the Tide crew saying, this could be perfect for you. You guys should look at this. And I was backing them. And about a year into that, I was like, I could do this. Why can't I do this? And then I was suddenly, I want to be considered. And that's when it was on the table in my mind. I was like, right, yeah, I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to do it. And I put it out there. And then, of course, the IOC made the decision in June. So that put the kibosh on that. But I've absolutely loved what I have done in the double-handed series. I've had a lot of fun doing it. And we've been really lucky in the current 18 months of a pandemic. We were out sailing more than anybody else. So I think we've been really lucky. Timing-wise, we've probably benefited from it.
Olympics or not, Dee, you've done a ton of offshore miles. You've had a stellar offshore career, racing at the very highest level. If you went back in time and told that young teacher that leaving that job would lead to all of these experiences, what do you think she would have thought?
I would have been like, that just can't be possible. You can't have a career doing amazing feats that you read about in magazines, you see on interviews on telly, you hear about in podcasts. I would not have equated the two of that could be me at all. And it's never been a long-term plan. It's just one has led to the other, to the other. I had no aspirations as a kid to sail around the world. And then once the doors open and you realise what's out there, I've kind of just grabbed as much as I can while I can. And I hope I still can grab some more.
Dee, it's been so good to hear your story. Thanks for sharing and for your time.
Thank you.
Dee Caffari, ladies and gentlemen. I know quite a lot of you that listen to this podcast, but there's an awful lot of you that listen who I don't know. So whoever you are, if you've listened to Dee and she's made you think about that great undone thing in your life, whether it's simply learning to sail, joining a sailing club, or maybe even crossing the Atlantic, take inspiration. To quote the great Mark Twain, throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbour and catch the trades in your sails. Dee Caffari did, and just look what she achieved. Amazing. Massive thanks to Dee for sitting down to record this. We sailed against each other for much of the double-handed offshore season, so it was really great to catch up. Dee, a massive thank you. You know we love to hear from you, so let me know what you think, like, review and subscribe on whatever platform you join us on. And if you're a regular listener, why not buy us a coffee if you're enjoying the pod? buymeacoffee.com/sailing podcast. To Tim at Vertigo Films, of course, a big thanks for making the podcast. Tim filmed Dee's Vendée start and finish and is full of stories about just how rough that start day was. Hours in a rib with a camera on his shoulder. It was a tough day. If you were on that Aviva hospitality boat, you'll know exactly what he means. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Have fun on the water and sail safe, everyone.
This is Castle 1. Race officer speaking.
Leyline is on boundary up ahead, 35 seconds out.
A bit lower and faster here.
Ho, ho, ho. That's a good one, Jimmy.
Still gaining on the lane line there. Gaining on the lane line
We're looking
there.
at 10-5, 42. Matching him on the boundary, yeah, copy.
This is Castle 1 standing by. Out.